Hello, I'm Julia DeNey, the founder of Sensational You, which is an adaptive sensory clothing brand designed specifically with autism and sensory needs in mind. A little bit about my background is that I majored in fashion design and then during COVID went on to work in special education with autistic students and saw how much sensory needs, especially in terms of clothing and just not having the right tools, really affected learning. And I knew that I could use my background in fashion design to create some of these solutions. I think one of the biggest things that is often misunderstood about sensory needs is how much it can impact things like behavior, communication, connection, and learning. And I think it can also lead to a lot of opportunities of really missed opportunities of inclusion because if kids are having a hard time and are not regulated, they're not able to go and be a part of a larger group or go to the birthday party or anything like that. So sensory needs is really a basic need that has to be met before so many other things. Something that I saw a lot in education that might feel familiar to a lot of you is that sensory needs are often categorized as behavior. So it's often not looked at as to why a child might have had some aggression or why they might have eloped and ran away. And oftentimes, if you look back, there were actually a lot of sensory triggers that led to that. So it's not necessarily a behavior that needs to be corrected, but rather a sensory need that's not being met. And they're too dysregulated to be able to listen and learn and are just generally having a hard time because of those sensory needs. So something that was important to me and in designing all our clothing was making sure that they were free of all irritants, such as tags that can be extremely painful, bulky seams that can rub against you and cause irritation every time you move, even restricted designs. If you think about a really heavy winter coat and you feel really trapped in it and you're not really able to move around and move your arms, that causes a problem because that sensation of not being able to move and feeling really restricted and the fabric bunching up at the sleeves or on the legs, that can also be really dysregulating and really painful to someone with sensory differences. I love the metaphor that a lot of people use around sensory needs that include, if you think about like a cup of water, and once that cup of water is overfilled, it will start pouring out. And that's really what can happen if too much sensory input is given to a child. So if you think about clothing such as these restrictive designs, the tag that cuts into them every time they move, seams that are extremely irritating, or a fabric that bothers them, baseline starting the day, you're filling their cup up pretty high with things that are already bothering them, already dysregulating, and they're already having to focus a lot on tolerating. So now, if you add a new demand or you add a peer yelling in the classroom or you add music class, anything else, that's going to topple over. And that's where you're going to see kind of those negative behaviors that get categorized, where the sensory input is just too much and their bodies and their brains just cannot handle it anymore. So with our clothing, we eliminated all of those irritants. And then also, if you think about in those moments of dysregulation, what would be the most helpful? And oftentimes, what I saw, especially in classrooms, is that you're not going to have the tools right on hand and available for you any second you may need them. So, for instance, in my school, we had a compression vest, but it was shared across classrooms. And even parents may relate to this. You may have one, but it's somewhere in the house. And in a moment where you see that they may need that sensory input, you're running around trying to find it. By the time you do and get back to the child and try to wrestle them into it, it's kind of past the point of it being preemptively helpful. And you're now wrestling a child who's already melting down into this compression vest, which is not an easy task. So if you think about that and all the other tools that you can't necessarily have on you at every time, at every moment, and at every moment you may need them, then that's where our sensory clothing really came in. I wanted to design something that was super convenient and had the tools on them at all times, hidden seamlessly within the clothing they wear every day. So, for instance, having a t-shirt that has compression built in underneath. And therefore, when they need that input, rather than running around and trying to find where the vest is, you're able to just lift up the t-shirt and tighten both sides, and they're able to get that calming hug feeling that can be really beneficial, especially for sensory seekers, much like a weighted blanket, but now without having the separate thing to wrangle them into. And so much of that is true across all different types of sensory tools. For instance, headphones can be incredible for helping with sound sensitivity. But for some kids, they don't like the pressure of the headphones, or those are the things that got left in the classroom when you went out on a walk because you didn't think they need them. But now there's a fire truck driving by. So we built a hoodie that has a sound blocking material built right into the hood. That way, when they're wearing their hoodie out for a walk, in the classroom, at home, on the couch, whatever happens, if there's a sudden noise that's going to bother them, they can easily put that hood up in a comfortable, easy, discreet, and quick way. Ultimately, with sensory needs, everything should be as convenient as possible. Having to work for sensory tools or hunt them down or not being able to reach them themselves is only going to further cause dysregulation and potential behaviors that you're going to see. Because if they don't have access to the tools they need, then they're not going to be able to keep their bodies regulated, calm, and focused on what you're doing, whether that's learning communication or whether that's learning math or learning anything else in the classroom. But that could also just be engaging with their peers and eating in the lunchroom and engaging in those conversations. So there's so many instances that they're not going to be able to be at their full potential if they don't have sensory tools available to them. And that can go from anything from fidgets to their headphones to compression to chewies if they love that oral stimulation. So even if you have all those little tools and you're just looking for a better way to make them accessible to your kids at all times, think about maybe putting them all in a backpack that they get to carry with them all the time, at least some of those smaller tools, so that if they need them, they know they can independently go get them. And there isn't kind of a barrier to entry to obtaining those tools that they may need. I think oftentimes you'll see, sometimes for my fellow educators, you'll see in different school settings, therapy settings, like occasionally someone will maybe have to be working towards their preferred fidget toy as if it's a regular toy. And I think that's where all of us as advocates can do a better job of understanding that tools and sensory tools are there as a basic need, just like sleep, just like eating. Those things have to be met before learning and anything else can happen. And by making them work for a tool that they potentially need, it may actually be counterproductive because they may not be able to learn unless they have the tools needed to stay regulated and focused. And I think there needs to be a really clear differential for educators, for the kid themselves, and expectation set that they always have access to the tools to stay regulated and anything they may need that's always accessible to them. And then different motivators, anything else that they may be using in school or therapy, whatever, up to their therapist and educator is separate. That is something that is just a preferred item. It's not something that is actually helping them regulate and focus. It's just a toy or it's just something else. And that needs to be really clear because working for sensory tools would be really counterproductive to what you're trying to do and what we're trying to do for these kids. So that is one other way to go about it if you don't want to immediately jump into using sensory clothes. But all of this is the thought process behind Sensational You and why I've been working really hard to design things and create things that are made for these autistic children and adults, really, because sensory needs aren't something they grow out of, and making sure they have the tools that they need to thrive. And I think that's actually an important point that I wanted to touch on, is that sensory needs are not something that they can just get over or they'll learn to deal with or that they'll grow out of. Sensory needs are something that need to be accommodated throughout their life. Sensory needs may change a little bit. They might, have different sensitivities than they did as a child, and things can change, especially within our sensory systems. It can change by the day, it can change by the week, it can change by the year. But adults also do have sensory needs. And that is why I also have adult sizes in our clothing, because I think sometimes that can be forgotten in some of the conversations that are had around behavior, around sensory, around autism as a whole, is kind of forgetting about the fact that autistic kids become autistic adults. And I think it's something to really keep in mind, especially as you just move throughout the world, that everyone may still have sensory needs who are around you. So you may be on a subway or on a public bus, and there may be someone who is an adult on their way to work, and they're going to still be using sensory tools like headphones or fidgets to make it through that commute. And I think that's something that we all need to do a better job of having a conversation about as a whole, as the world, as society, because it is something that I think gets forgotten, and then it makes it more isolating for these autistic adults and for these kids that have grown up with certain supports and certain accommodations and a certain understanding. And then as soon as they turn 18 or 20 or they start becoming an adult, that people look at it differently or think they don't need the same tools because they're for children. And so I think that's a really important thing that we can all just do a better job of making the message really clear about and being really strong in all of our messaging around the world. I think sensory needs is something that often does get talked about in a school setting. And it is something, though, that needs to be accommodated both at home and at school and at work as they get older. And that's where I'm curious where people may have any questions about is just what they can be doing. I think at school, you get really lucky with having occupational therapists kind of on hand to help craft your classrooms. Also, just having educators that listen to things like this and are more interested in being more sensory aware and more accommodating of sensory needs. Also having great parents who advocate for their kids and their sensory needs. And I am curious if anyone has questions about how that can then translate to a home setting or on the go. If you want to then go to a restaurant and you're not at the safe place at home, or you're curious of how to build a sensory safe place at home. Oftentimes schools do have sensory rooms, which are incredible. It's a great place for kids to be able to escape to. And that's something that can be easily replicated at home and can be added into your routine. And even if it's just a corner of a room, it's a safe area that has a bunch of sensory tools and calming things like bean bags and weighted blankets and any of the other sensory tools we've talked about, all in an area so they know they can go and have a sensory break and calm down and have the things they need right in a safe area where they won't be bothered or they won't be dragged away from it, or loud noises and anything disruptive won't be added to them when they're in that space trying to regulate. And that can be really comforting and just give a better sense of security. I think sometimes it's forgotten how much anxiety can play a role when it comes to sensory needs, because you're entering in new environments and the person is not sure what that environment's going to be like, whether there's going to be really loud noises that are triggering or painful. They're not sure how many people are going to be in there, what the temperature is going to be like, if they're going to have the sensory supports they need, if they get overwhelmed. So all of that can lead up to extra anxiety that happens during transitions, or if you notice having a hard time in new environments. And if you have a strong plan in place, so you have a safe place they know they can go, a lot of that anxiety can be eliminated. All of that anxiety can also show itself when it's something that they've had a bad experience with before. I think that's where dressing can be really challenging for a lot of families, where a child does have sensory needs and does have a hard time with certain clothing. And before they have been dressed and put into clothing that has been painful or been uncomfortable for them. So now getting dressed just feels more and more daunting every morning because they're anticipating that discomfort and that pain that they may be experiencing during that experience of getting dressed with certain clothing elements. So all of that may be why mornings are getting harder and harder when getting dressed rather than getting easier. And that's something that you can so easily try to break the cycle of as soon as possible and just make getting dressed a more exciting experience and a happier experience. So the goal being that they get ready and they may not even be thinking about it. And some ways to do that is one, giving them choice. That can eliminate a lot of that leading up anxiety if they feel like, even if it's just holding up two shirts and they get to grab or point to the one they may want, it's giving them some control over a situation that is otherwise really anxiety producing and really dysregulating for them. So, choice is a really great way to go about it. The other way is to start incorporating more sensory activities. So, rather than immediately jumping into getting dressed and wrestling them into the clothing, start with a session swinging or jumping on the trampoline or getting to spin around or having 5 minutes of playing with their favorite sensory toys, and then slowly incorporating the clothing in. And the best way is to start your morning with more extra time than you think. I think the only thing that can add more stress and more anxiety to an already overwhelming situation is when you're now running late. And I think we have all had those mornings where you're just running late and it just needs to get done and you need to get out the door in the next 2 minutes. But that's going to add to an already heightened situation if they already struggle with getting dressed and they already don't like it and they already have anxiety around it. That added stress and time pressure where you now don't have the time to be patient and work it through and have sensory activities built in and give choices and have a more calming experience, that's only going to heighten the struggle you're going to have in getting them dressed. So leaving enough time in the mornings where you don't feel that stress is going to kick them off on a way more regulated, calm note for the day. And it's going to allow them to enter school or work or wherever they're going. You guys may be going to a family event altogether. Wherever you're going, it's going to start that day at a less filled cup, as we talked about earlier. They're going to start out a lot calmer and they're going to be able to tolerate a lot of other things throughout the day because they didn't already kind of use up all that tolerance and energy and anxiety around the clothing that they're wearing. And I think that's important even for formal events to think about the most sensory friendly options. Formal wear can definitely be the most restricting, not be the most breathable, have uncomfortable tags and uncomfortable fabrics, but trying to pare it down where obviously some events require a certain dress code and that's hard to get around. But in today's fashion world and everything else, there's so many accommodations that can be made. And just trying to search through and find the best things. And if you can't, finding great ways to modify them. So if you can't find a dress shirt without a tag in it, then try cutting it out or using a seam ripper to get it out and create as best of a scenario as you can out of what's required. But if there's not a dress code, I think it's great to first accommodate sensory needs and then think more about style. Something like jeans can look great and be kind of a dressier casual. However, jeans can be a nightmare for sensory needs and is probably one of the top complaints I heard about and saw within my students and all my research is the denim can be so restrictive and the feeling of it and the way it bunches up, and it can be a bad experience for those with sensory needs. So rather than that, allow them to wear the joggers, allow them to wear something that, yes, is a little more casual, but is going to set them up for a better experience. And yes, that's obviously not something that can always be done. Again, as I said, if there's a dress code, obviously there's other ways to make accommodations and find the best options possible. But if there's not a dress code, then definitely allowing for the more casual, comfortable clothing that are their preferred. If there's a shirt that has no tags, it's flat seams, they love wearing it. It's okay if they want to wear that 5 out of 7 days in the week, besides when you're washing it. I think it's okay because then you're going to set them up better to learn, better communicate, have better experiences outside of the home because their basic sensory needs are being met. And yeah, that's, I think, the overview I really wanted to give about sensory needs, sensory clothing options, and the impact sensory can have on behavior. But I'm definitely happy to continue answering any questions that you guys may have, whether it's specifically about your child, something in general about school or communicating sensory needs to their staff. I know some people have questions about adding sensory clothing into IEPs. Some schools have dress codes such as, or dressing rules such as not allowing hoods up in school. And our sound reducing hoodie is something that can be added to an IEP or a 504 plan or any sort of personalized education plan that your child may have in their school. And it can be added in as a sensory accommodation. And that way, it's known to the school and the staff that this is something that is needed for their sensory needs and is an exemption to the overall policy of the school. And that's something I know a lot of parents don't know about, that that's something you can add in and you can ask for special accommodations for. And as long as it's in that legal document, then they're set. They can't tell them they can't wear the hood because of the other dressing school policy, because this is an exception. And if you have any troubles with your staff or getting that added or any sort of accommodation, advocates can be a huge help. They do this day in and day out, and they really know how to get things added and make sure IEPs are enforced if that's something you're worried about. I know a lot of parents have had questions about being worried that the teachers and the staff, or if the teacher's out and there's a substitute, IEP's not being followed. And that is where an advocate can be really helpful. My number one tip that I've heard from advocates too is just to document everything. Make sure you have documentation of it. So if you know it wasn't followed, make sure to keep that proof so that when you're entering a meeting and you're entering a conversation on how to fix that and how to make sure it's being followed, you're not talking out of nowhere. You have the evidence for them to kind of go off of and say, this is exactly what happened, or this is what I heard. How can we avoid this in the future? And be able to kind of have more of those productive conversations rather than just hearing, oh, of course we follow the IEP, but you know secretly that there were some miscommunications or there were some mishaps or whatever it was. They weren't allowed to wear their hoodie or they weren't allowed to use their fidget in the lunchroom or whatever it was. Make sure that that's documented in some way and just make sure you advocate for yourself and your child. Yeah, let me know if you have any other questions that would be useful for me to answer. Let's see, we do have another one. Okay, what tools or assessments do you recommend for understanding a child's sensory profile and its effect on their learning? Yeah, so what's really great is that you know your child best and you're with them a lot of the time. So you're able to kind of track what's happening. And I think that's truly the best way to do it is create any sort of document. It can even be handwritten on a piece of paper and make a chart, but track out their essentially their behavior that you see versus the sensory environment, the sensory tool being used, anything like that. So even if you're at home and it's not directly applicable to learning because they're not learning something, you're just at home, you're going to see that effect on behavior and even their ability to listen to what you're saying or their ability to sit down at dinner. So being able to track those things, and if you notice, hey, I tracked it and he's a lot calmer at dinner time whenever we use the headphones, I think he's sensitive to noise. That's something that you can then use and take to teachers so that they can then apply it to the learning environment and they can do their own tracking of the differences they see in the classroom based on different sensory tools. A lot about someone's sensory profile really is observing their behavior and observing what tools work. And that's going to take some trial and error. But ultimately, there are a lot of little things that you can be looking at without having to purchase tools even. So if there's someone that ultimately could benefit from a compression vest. There might also be a kid that loves when you give them squeezes, or they love being wrapped up tight in a blanket. So a lot of that you can see and assess and take note of at home with just what you have before you move on to some of those other tools that may be a little more directly applicable in a classroom setting where they're still able to learn with a vest on versus it's a little harder to learn wrapped up in a blanket, but it's a very similar sensory input. So you'll notice that a lot of times it will be different across different sensory input too. So you'll hear the terms sensory seeker and sensory avoider, but it can be a mix. You can have a child that is a sensory avoider when it comes to sound, but loves the compression and loves the squeezes and is a sensory seeker for proprioceptive input some of the time. They also might come across as a really picky eater if they're sensory avoidant around certain foods and textures. But they may love crunchy food because it gives them a certain sensory input that they love. So that profile you can really start to build just based on observations through their day across all the different types of sensory input. Thank you so much for joining my live today and learning a little bit more about sensory needs and the importance of meeting sensory needs as it impacts behavior, learning, and connection.